we don't have any surprise adjustments, but I can't guarantee that that won't happen. So my numbers will be more fun later. We will need to do some year-end budget transfers. I need to get those figures. That'll probably be on the September board meeting, and then the auditors themselves will be on site, which I believe means Zoom still, but they will be doing their test work, their annual test work mid-September. So before we kind of dive into just a quick summary of the numbers, I just wanted to, particularly for this year, just do a little concept refresher on the difference between when I say budget to expenditures versus when I say revenue to expenditures in terms of our year-end results. So this year is weird. Those two things are not usually all that different. But this year they are for a few reasons, which I'll get to on the next slide. But just a reminder what the difference is. So basically, you know, our budget is our voter-approved spending threshold, and that is, you know, based on both revenue estimates and expenditure estimates, and where they meet. That's our budget. That's what the voters authorize, and that's our legal threshold up to which we can spend. But that does not mean we're going to meet our revenue targets. And so to the extent that we do not meet our revenue targets, it's prudent to reduce our expenditures, despite the fact that our voter threshold, you know, expenditure threshold remains the same. So revenue to actuals is, you know, pretty clear, you know, where we actually landed on actual revenue versus our actual expenditures. And those numbers are quite different from each other this year, which I'll explain on the next slide. So with that in mind, our budget to actuals, we have a sizable balance. You know, budget to actuals wise, we're showing $3.5 million left on the bottom line this year. That will change a little bit because I still need to do some adjustments specifically for food services. The revenue shortfall is actually ultimately going to be reflected as an expense of the general fund, and I also need to do a few adjustments related to seed. So these numbers won't necessarily stay exactly the same, but this is sort of conceptually, I think, what makes the most sense, and in reality reflects where we were short on the revenue side and what we had left over on the expenditure side. So part of that 3.5 million, first off, which is something that we haven't talked about for a while, so just to remind you, we had $1 million budgeted for BFOF this year. That was a repayment that we did not need to make because the debt service schedule changed after the budget. And we knew that early on, and we repurposed that $1 million to CIP. And that was part of why we got approved for so much in CIP projects for the upcoming year. So that's $1 million of that. $1 million, then we also had as a revenue shortfall. So 700,000 in food services, 300,000 in Medicaid are the kind of the way the numbers are looking right now. So in terms of food services, you know, that's the revenue side shortfall only. There were cost savings in food costs. So some of that 3.5 million you're seeing left over in the budget, some of that is food costs. That's offsetting that revenue deficit. So that is not the food services shortfall itself. Some of that was offset you know, by reduction in food costs because they were serving fewer meals. So the food services shortfall is approximately 400. After you take that into account. And then of course we've got $800,000 budgeted in fund balance, and there's no revenue associated with that to the extent that, you know, we need to realize that budgeted fund balance we do, but there's no actual revenue associated with that. So at the end of the day, when we have $3.5 million left budget to actuals, revenue to actuals, we have 700,000 left, and that is great. That's a better outcome than I expected. I expected, if you recall, in the spring and even in late spring, trying to project where we might have some closure-related savings. I had expected us to break even revenue to expenses. You know, I expected that we had a fair amount of savings to offset our revenue losses and our extra costs. And it turns out that we saved a little more than I had expected, which isn't shocking because I was really trying to capture explicitly known savings, such as, you know, transportation, certain stipends, et cetera. But there were other places where clearly we had some savings, and also some expenses that I'm sure we would have had if we hadn't closed, such as subs. I'm sure we would have gone over budget in subs last year if we hadn't had closure, right? So at the end of the day, I can't tell you exactly what, where we landed related to closure in terms of did we save money, did we spend a little extra money, because I don't know where we would have landed in an alternate universe where we didn't have this situation. But I think using reasonable assumptions, I'm coming to conclude that we probably broke about even there, and then the 700,000 is really reflective of kind of a general surplus that we would expect each year anyway. So it's excellent news because that means we increase our fund balance by about 700,000 if these numbers stay where they are looking right now. And that brings our unassigned fund balance to about 4.5 million, and that's 4.1% of our FY20 general fund budget. And I quote that figure because there is a state cap of 3% that we are now in excess of, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. It's good news, but it is something that we have to address. And then finally, as I said, in a future meeting, once we've done more audit work, and maybe even after we've had the audit, I'll go over, our line item results. But the general areas of surplus are not unexpected. They're places that we expected to have some surplus: salary and benefits, transportation, stipends, training and travel, contingency rentals. Those are all things that we expected to see some surplus related to closure, especially. And in addition to those places, we did a little bit better than I had expected in some of those areas. And additionally, we had more savings in food costs, supplies, tuition, and contractual services than I had previously thought. So altogether, came out better than we'd hoped, and positive results for the year in general. So finally, just the key points, I think we can feel good that we're going to come in the black in FY20. Closure essentially broke even to the best of my ability to tell. And just in general, relatively few areas ran budget deficits in general. So that's, I think, in part because of closure, but particularly perhaps with subs and maybe utilities. But there were also several places in the prior year where we had substantial non-salary deficits. Transportation in particular comes to mind, as does special ed tuition. And those were adjusted. You guys adjusted them the way you should have for FY20. I can't take credit, I wasn't here, but so we just didn't have those types of deficits this year. So, and finally, with respect to fund balance, the timing couldn't be better. The fund balance is strong, and it offers a hedge to potential curtailments or revenue shortfalls this year, potentially with food services, and of course, potential state curtailments. But there is a cap of 3% set by the state, unfortunately, because it's quite a small cap if you ask me. But in any case, there is a state set cap of 3%, which means basically the rule is if you're going to exceed that cap, you need to set a plan to spend the excess down so that you're back under 3% over the next 3 years. And so we need to think about what that plan will look like. The auditors are probably going to ask me for it. So I'm not sure. I think maybe we could start that discussion in the finance committee, and it does need to go to the full board, so we probably should do that sooner rather than later. I think as long as we're in discussion, I'll be okay for the audit, but we'll need to move on that somewhat soon. My personal feeling on this is our plan should probably be to the extent we don't have curtailments or major revenue shortfalls in the upcoming year, that we intend to spend it in anticipation of offsetting reductions in state funding. But that's just my initial feeling is we're expecting reductions in state funding over the next few years. That's the time to consider a bit higher in terms of budgeting our fund balance, and that will help soften those blows. So that's it for FY20, and I'll pause.
Just make sure, Mr. hand is up.
Yeah, I'll pause for any questions.
Thanks, Miranda. This is overall very good news. I'm just wondering if there are limitations on how we spend the excess of the cap.
Limitations on how we, like what that plan entails?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, not to my knowledge. I can check with the lawyers, but I don't think there's any particular stipulations. The last time there was an excess fund balance, I believe what happened was, and I don't know if any of you were actually on the board at the time, probably were, it was reallocated to reserve funds, capital reserve. And I'll talk about that too. We're going to talk about the capital reserve. I don't think we should do that this time just because we already have a capital reserve, never spent it since then. It requires a council vote, and I just feel like we're going to need it in the next few years. That could certainly be a backstop, like in year 3 if we haven't spent it, to potentially reallocate it to a reserve fund such as a capital reserve. But I don't. You do mean in terms of like how we spend it? I don't think so. I think we would just budget fund balance or move it into a different reserve fund.
Yeah, if you think about it, we had $800,000 from our reserve budgeted for this year, and we didn't have it specified to this line or that line. It was revenue coming in that was part of our overall revenue accrual. So there's no specifics around what you can or can't use it for. But I just want to, well, I think it's great that we're there, but a couple of things. One is this year, because of COVID, there was additional flexibility given to districts to be able to carry a larger fund balance. Do you remember, am I recalling that correctly, Miranda?
Now that you mention it, it sounds familiar, but I have to be honest, I kind of forgot. So maybe, I believe we're still obligated to make a plan. My recollection is, I know what you're saying and it sounds familiar, but for some reason I can't remember exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly what the end result was on that.
And the other point that I was going to make is, like, we had $800,000 from our fund balance, sort of budgeted for this year, which we didn't wind up having to use. But if we had used that and didn't replenish didn't add to it with the 700,000 that we're forecasting right now, we would be pretty close to, the 3%. And so it's easy come and easy go. So I wouldn't, while I'm glad that it is on the upside as opposed to the downside, it's not a huge, it's not a huge ton of money. As Miranda said, that cap is a very small cap. It's not much of a rainy day fund, if you ask me. So, yeah.
I'm confident we won't have trouble figuring out a plan to spend that money.
I think you're probably right about that. Any other questions on FY20 before we move into a completely different topic? Okay. So we say goodbye to FY20, say hello to FY21, which everyone is very excited about. All right. So starting off just kind of with a general list of what I see as our funding sources to manage our pandemic response. First and foremost, of course, the coronavirus relief funds. That's a $6.2 million allocation. The allocation is linked. If you download the PDF, you can link into the allocation from there. It's a formula-driven allocation. And you're welcome to look at it, but I honestly haven't even spent a major amount of time trying to understand it. The state came up with a great formula. We got a nice chunk of money, and all the details are there to the extent you want to take a look. The CARES contingency, which we all knew about from before. A possible, but
can we recap that real quick? So that's about $2 million overall in CARES. And then, the difference between the 2 million and the 650 is primarily paying for custodians this year.
Yep. So initially it sounded like that, likely that we would get a second installment or potential increase to the CRF, and the superintendent as of yesterday is saying that is looking less likely, unfortunately. So it's not something we can plan on, but is a potential source of additional funding. And then of course, COVID related savings or operating budget to the extent savings materialize as we enter the year, which of course is impossible to know right at this point in time. But certainly even, small things like field trips, there's going to be fewer field trips. We think we know that for sure. We can start to put some numbers to those things and potentially reallocate from there. And then potential utilization of the capital reserve, which is a topic on my list for the city, they're just flat out. I haven't really been able to get a good conversation going with them about the process to potentially use that, but we do have $3 million on the books in a capital reserve fund. Anything expended from there would require council approval. So the way I'm sort of looking at this is, first and foremost, for our big priorities to start the year, we look to our coronavirus relief funds. Ideally, we keep the CARES contingency just that, a contingency, because there's still a huge amount of unknowns specifically, and I think most concerning to me is just the HR implications of leave coverage. We just can't put a number to that yet. And so I think keeping that sort of as a contingency, but recognizing we do have that and potentially allocating some of that, recognizing that hopefully we'll have some savings and potentially we can use a capital reserve to offset anything that we're sort of using that as a buffer for. So I see this as a descending list, starting with coronavirus relief funds, and then maybe allocating some of the contingency, hoping to offload that later so we can carry it into FY22 to the extent possible. Emily, would you like to ask a question now, or?
Just a quick question on the capital reserve. Are you thinking that we might try and use that to pay the FOF debt?
I actually don't know if the capital reserve can be used for debt service. I mean, I guess it's possible. I had that fleeting thought at one point in time, but I think what we're thinking about specifically is potentially utilizing it for some of the facilities projects that aren't necessarily in the CRF application, potentially forgive me if I'm misstating this, but the ionizers in the district-wide plan for ionizers, which is about 500,000. We didn't put that in the CRF application yet, but to the extent we want to enact the district-wide plan, that might be a good way to utilize those funds. Potentially using it to not incur future debt service for CIP projects. Another thing that has crossed my mind just as a use potentially in general in a difficult budget year. But again, I need to have a conversation with the city about this in terms of the strategy for that, utilizing that. The documentation is a bit fuzzy in terms of what was and was not previously expended from it. So there's some legwork to do with the city on it, but I need to get moving on that so we know our options. And so finally on the slide, I mean, it's just, I think we all have to, and part of this bullet in red is like saying this to myself, like we have to be adaptable and recognize that the budget's going to be a moving target. That's just the way it's going to be. And we're going to have to make some difficult decisions potentially if things don't go the way we want them to, but to some extent we need to just be able to bite the bullet, move forward on certain things, while also remaining cautious and making sure we have contingency buffers in place. So that's just sort of the overall in terms of our general response resources and general strategy. And then I'm going to dive into specifically what the coronavirus relief funds can be used for and what we intend to submit our initial application, what categories we intend to submit in our initial application. So the state defined kind of broad use categories are transportation, facilities, nutrition services, HR, I guess you could say, subs, temps, contractual services, or additional staff, professional development, or technology. And then there's some very specific and challenging restrictions. First off, it has to be liquidated by December 30th, and that's not even committed. It has to literally be out of our bank account by 12/30, and that's unusual for grants. Usually, you committed and you have a grace period to actually pay the bills, but we have to have the money out the door by 12/30, and that also means that any paychecks associated with this, that ends really the first pay period of December, right? Because that second pay period in December is actually the checks cut in January, so it's a hard stop at the end of the year. It has to be only for otherwise unbudgeted expenses. If it's in our budget, we can't put it in this. So it can't supplant is the grant terminology for that. It has to be a COVID-19 explicitly driven expense, and it can't serve as revenue replacement, which is a bit unfortunate given that, you know, we're likely to see some revenue shortfalls again in food services. That said, you know, I just got through saying our fund balance position is strong. So, you know, I'm not as worried about that as I otherwise would be, because we can absorb some shortfall on our revenue targets. But it's still unfortunate that we can't utilize the grant funds for that. So the initial deadline is August 30th. I'm hoping to submit tomorrow for our initial application because we do have the opportunity to revise it. So there's no reason to wait. I want to get the ball rolling on some of the big projects that we know about, get our kind of concepts out there and approved, and then we can refine it over the course of the next few weeks. So at this point in time, there's kind of 4 chunks of projects that we're looking to utilize these funds for. So technology is the big one, 2.9 million. Community partners, and that includes potentially purchasing some buses so that we can transport folks to childcare. So community partners is really what we're talking about is childcare services, childcare contracts. Human resources, and when I say human resources, I'm saying that really broadly. I don't mean the human resources department, of course. I mean like increases to FTEs, subs, etc., and facilities at 700,000. So in those 4 categories, just a little bit more about what's included. Technology, we've got a robust one-to-one student device plan, staff device refresh, a little small expense for software, and increased tech support. I think the tech support is under $60,000. It's not substantial, but a small increase for the tech staff to be able to support these new devices. Community partners, childcare contracts, and 4 buses, as I mentioned. Human resources, we've got a plan for the building subs that were mentioned at the board meeting. And some other structured temp support, like a nurse sub. We've got some temp drivers and a few other things that we know about, some temp coverage in HR just to manage the insane workload that they're seeing right now. And then also a buffer for leave coverage, which is a very nebulous concept right now, but you know, a big issue, obviously. And then potentially some increased FTEs for special ed, ELL, and specials. And those are, you know, those are challenging because if we increase those FTEs, unless it's, you know, it's very hard to hire somebody to work just until December. So, you know, we have to make sure that we have a plan in place following December to be able to fund any FTEs that we do increase. So they have to be obviously priorities to be able to commit to funding them for the whole year. And finally, facilities, window replacement, UV lighting, HEPA filters, the Reiki ionizers and the ventilation unit are in, purifiers, fans, and some general buffers for storage, general supplies, and a placeholder for outdoor classrooms, which we don't have a great estimate on right now. So those are some of the things that are going to go into the application in concept, so we can get rolling, and we'll continue to refine from here on out. So, I mean, there's a lot of considerations, obviously, a lot of trade-offs in terms of how to deal with or how to utilize these funds, because obviously we want to utilize them. We don't want to be too cautious and then end up not being able to get the devices in time, or not quite having the leave coverage problems that we expect to have and then leaving money on the table. So, you know, we need to make sure, though, that we don't spend too quickly and spend something soon that actually ends up being a lower priority. So we need to kind of balance the priority levels. So starting off now just by carving out the big chunks, priority areas, submit the initial application, get the ball rolling, and then we'll continue to refine. And then, you know, from there, we need to really hone in on our prioritization, hone in on our estimates, and then we'll submit our final application by September 30th. So I think that's all I've got on CRF. I don't know if we want to have that discussion. I can just do this last slide, I guess. I tuned into a little bit of the ops committee meeting. And so I just wanted to address a couple of the things that came up. Food services, I'm expecting revenue challenges to be the biggest issue with food services again this year. Just talking with Jane in a super preliminary level, we could be looking again at a deficit, 500 to 800,000. That's taking revenue losses and food cost savings potentially into account. That's super preliminary, but it's a sizable deficit to the extent we stay in this sort of plan moving forward. That's sort of what we would expect to see over the course of the year. But as I said, it's a revenue side problem, so it's sort of akin to a curtailment. So it's slightly less problematic in terms of just budget management on the expense side. It doesn't increase our expenses. So it's less concerning, but still obviously not ideal. And of course, we can't use the grant funding for it because it's very clearly revenue replacement, and that is not eligible for CRF.
Miranda, I meant to ask you this morning when you laid out on what was the broad uses category, it says nutrition. What is nutrition then, if not that?
They said equipment. I don't know why COVID would mean we need additional food services equipment. I just don't know. I think most districts.
Pizza this year, so.
What's that?
We're only serving pizza this year, so we need lots of pizza ovens. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, packaging maybe. Maybe in a smaller district, a very small expense, something related to that would make a big impact, and they would want to put this on the grant. I think our increased expenditures in food services just aren't rising to the level of needing to be put on this grant versus other things. So I don't know, maybe other districts are different, but I don't get the sense that other districts are putting a lot in for that. I think most are in our shoes where they're facing revenue shortfalls on the food side. So yeah, where was I? So facilities, the question came up, I know Steve had mentioned coming back to you guys with an estimate for the ionizers district-wide, and so he was able to get that yesterday, and that came to about 420. That does not include the Reiki ionizers and the ventilation unit for Reiki. That's separate, and that's already included in the CRF application. I think that came to about 80,000 together, those two items. And presently, the ionizers for the district-wide plan are not included in the CRF application. That does not mean it can't go in. We can change that level of priority and put it in to the extent we choose to do that. But so far, it's not actually in the plan that I intend to submit very soon. But again, that's just an initial application, and we have about a month and a half to make any revisions to that stuff. So.
And did he give you the estimate for the entire district? Did he have that, or just the Reiki one? That
is the entire district. Unless I'm misunderstanding something, that is the district, and Reiki was about 40 grand for the ionizers and 40 grand for the ventilation unit. So Reiki altogether came to 80. So I think he'd said something like 700 at the ops committee meeting, but I had asked him about that because the per unit quote that he gave did come out to around 450 or 500. So I think maybe he just, I don't know, quoted the wrong thing at that point. So I think that's the district-wide plan. So overall, it's 500 if you include the Reiki stuff. So that's all I got. Happy to take any questions and open it up to discussion. I think it's easier to have the discussion without the screen share, but if anybody wants me to go back to any slides, maybe if you want to, anyone think you're going to have me go back to any slides, you can do that now.
Okay. Maybe, can you go back to the slide that had the breakdown, the kind of further breakdown of what yeah, right there. I'm just wondering if anybody has kind of more detailed questions about this. I was wondering about the devices and just kind of how far that's going to go, who's going to get them. Do we have an idea of that at this point?
We do that. That gets us to an additional 6,400 devices. So and then we have about 1,100 new devices that, that we bought and we got from the Department of Ed. So that is like 7,400 additional devices, 7,500 additional devices so that gets us one-to-one across the district. Brand new equipment, everything on the same platform. So, it's all Chromebook based platform. So from a maintenance and management perspective, it shoots us ahead light years. So that's all of the, that's on the student side. And then on the staff side, that gets us refresh for virtually everyone that has not had a refresh in the last, as you know, we did just recently an elementary teacher refresh, so that would not be included, but otherwise it gets everybody into new devices. Old devices can be brought back in and used as backup devices. So it really does move us forward significantly. This also includes the connectivity through hotspots that we need to be able to, have full coverage. So I think this is everything. This is
That's awesome. I see hands now. So I have Roberto, then Tim, then Mark.
Yeah, so I guess part of my question on the technology was going to be about the hotspots. But I guess when you say that it's part of it, so I know in the spring, you and I were talking about this the other day, Javier, in the spring, when we started to identify the students that needed them and they were distributed, there's still a significant gap that we didn't get to back then, right? Like, so that, like when you're talking about one-on-one for the hotspots, that's continuing the work that you started in the spring, identifying who needed connectivity at home, or Judge, can you tell us more about that part, the connectivity piece?
Yeah, I don't have all of the detail. It's an additional 700 hotspots. That's what, I have in the information that I got, but I don't know exactly how we determined that 700 is what we needed. I think that was part of our survey with the DOE. So I think that's where that number came from. So I can get you additional information if you want, but that's all I have.
Yeah, I think it's important because, like you said, one of the big bonuses of having the Chromebooks and having everybody in the same devices is, as teachers are trying to work students through getting into documents or whatever, they can give the same instructions to the whole cohort and everybody's following, as opposed to like, oh, in your device it would be here, in that device it would be there. So that is so. But then when you don't have the same coherency in connectivity, then all that kind of equity-based approach is out the window. Like you have the kid with the hotspot, and then him and two siblings are connected, and then they can't even like watch a video, versus another kid that's got Wi-Fi at home. They have incredible bandwidth. So I guess the attention to how much we can help with the connectivity piece would be great. I mean, we're allocating a big chunk of it to technology, so obviously I can tell that the priority is in place there, 2.9 mil. So, but again, to me, the connectivity piece, I mean, we can give somebody the top end device, but if they can't plug it in.
Yeah, I will acknowledge that it is not, this is not, huge bandwidth. So it will have limits. It will be enough to run the classroom level work that we would need to do, but it's not, it won't be as, as great connectivity as, you might have at home or I might have at home, paying what we pay for it. So.
Are the teachers, oh, sorry. I just had a quick follow-up question on that. Are the teachers all using the same platform at this point?
That is part of this, is to get us to consistent platforms. So there's a number, I think that it's mentioned there, software necessary, increase the tech support. In the software, there are things like Seesaw, Zoom for teachers, campus learning. So different, part of the work this summer has been for teachers to come together and reach agreement around those common platforms. And so we will be able to do that. And that's included in here.
Great. Roberto, did you have anything else?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I think it'd be great just to, and I'm not sure who we could get more clarification on, but the fact that one of the parameters does state nutritional services, it'd be great to just really explore that, because my sense is that everyone is dealing with revenue losses in their nutritional services. So the fact that they included that in the relief funds makes me want to say that they want to help us capture some of those losses to some extent. So however we can explore that to more depth, I think would be great.
I can sort of answer that quickly if you want. The actual specific sentence says equipment related to nutrition services, additional heating and refrigeration carts, etc. That's a description that was provided by the state. So it's very specific about equipment. It was me who wasn't as specific about equipment in my slide. And I will say that in every single business manager meeting that I've been on, somebody has asked, can we use these funds for, food service revenue that we've lost? And the answer is no, not because the state doesn't want to allow us, but because the, grantor, which is, it's not the DOE, it's the Treasury, actually, for this particular grant, for whatever reason, has explicitly stated it cannot be revenue replacement. So it's just the restrictions of the grant from the federal funding side. So I feel pretty confident that it's not something that we can pursue, but I'm happy to be the one to ask it in the next meeting. But it's, it's something that you are right. Everybody's feeling it and everybody's asking, and it's been a no over and over again, unfortunately.
No, but if it's been clarified, obviously no need to put it out there again. Yeah, that's it. The other question, which is you mentioned that Javier found out yesterday that it's very unlikely there's going to be a second round. Through what change did we find this out?
So I raised the question at the superintendent's, it sort of put it on the superintendent's agenda yesterday because, originally I was under the impression that, that there was a second round because there's like 300+ million and this was accessing half of that. But then when I received something from the DOE last week, it sounded more like, oh, we're gonna see if there are additional unmet needs and then see if there is money to reallocate for that purpose. So that's where I started getting a heebie-jeebie feeling that maybe this wasn't just a given. And so when they explained it to me yesterday, Eileen King from MSMA, who comes to our meetings, said that if there is additional money coming from a federal bailout, that we will get additional money, and otherwise it's highly unlikely because they have significant other unmet needs in other departments, childcare, things along those lines, health and human services. And so they're looking to reallocate the remainder of that $350 million that was in the governor's office to some of those expenses in all likelihood. And so there may not be much left for education after that. So that was the bad news.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, sharing that. I didn't have any other questions, but yeah, I'll just stop there. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so next I have Tim.
Hey, thank you, Anna. I was wondering about the devices. I actually got a letter from Friends of Portland Adult Ed today, and it sounds like they had a lot of students not engaged with learning in the springtime because of technology, and I'm wondering, is there any restriction on using CRF funds? Is there any plan to use CRF funds to help to bridge that technology gap for Portland Adult Ed?
There's no restriction on it. We are not planning to use it for that. You know, so we've been offloading some of our devices to Portland Adult Ed to, you know, for them to give to people, not for us to manage them. Because it's a completely different, you know, structure. We don't have, you know, like, you know, we don't have the same level of access to people that we do, you know, on the elementary side or on the pre-K-12 side. You know, folks basically just take them with them. And so and they're also adults, so we don't need to control what they see or don't see. So we don't want to manage them. And so I know that they've gotten additional money. Friends of Portland Adult Ed has gotten additional money. We've given them used devices. And I don't remember the scope. I don't know, Miranda, if you do, of how much we've actually spent on that, but there's been, you know, some money put into it. And they also, so in the CRF funding, they were just allocated an additional $200,000, which I don't know. I've not had an opportunity to talk to Anita, you know, in terms of what she was going to do with that. But I know that this is a big priority for her. So.
Yeah, my apologies. I should have added the adult ed 200,000 to this presentation, and I actually remembered it and was mentioning that to Javier like 5 minutes before. So, and then I forgot again to mention it, which I had intended to. But yeah, they got a $200,000 allocation, and so when we are able to connect with them, we can share with you what they're planning to use that for.
Great, thank you. I've gotten this question from a couple of folks, and it wasn't mentioned at all. But is there any requirement related to the relief fund to reopen school in a hybrid mode or anything like that? Is this funding any sort of pressure to reopen?
No.
No. Okay. And then I guess the other thing, you know, thinking forward to January, if indeed there's not an additional round of funding, could the lack of funding and that lack of resources, is that possible that would, you know, not allow us to meet the requirements that the state has outlined for physically present school? And force us to move to remote learning in 2021. Okay. I think that's all I had. Thank you.
Next, I have Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the community partners. I know in the last business meeting, I guess they were identified some potential community partners. I just want to see where we are with that. Have we actually started specifically identifying community partners, or are we still like identifying them?
We'll have an update at Tuesday's meeting. We talked about it this morning. Grace is working on that. They have a meeting tomorrow, and so she'll be prepared to talk about that in more detail at Tuesday's meeting as part of the workshop.
Great. Thank you.
Emily?
My question also was about the community partners, and I'm just wondering the line item or placeholder that we have here, how does that match up to the need?
So the placeholder for that is transportation plus a per pupil allocation for a certain number of days of service. So it is, you know, very much a sort of a placeholder. So it's, you know, $10, and I'm making up a number. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it wasn't made up. It was looking at what, you know, what other locales have done around this. X number of dollars per students times a assumption of, you know, 50% of our students using that every day. And that's how we got to the $1.5 million plus that is in for that purpose.
Thank you.
Roberto?
Yeah. So I guess on same thing on the community partners on the what's included. You know, we have childcare and transportation. And so I'm thinking that you're not just limiting it to just those two things, correct? Because like I'm thinking, for example, like folks that like folks like cultivating community that have you know, like a lot of the that could be strong partners for a lot of this outdoor education piece, like the, you know, the curriculum, even the support to the like the stuff that they actually do during normal times, where they support the teachers when they bring the kids outside. So being that there is some support from the board for this outdoor learning opportunities, so something like that with a community partner that does support more of the day-to-day stuff.
That's not what that particular allocation is, but there is some of the costs under the HR bucket are for, you know, people coordinating the outdoor learning.
Yeah, and so that's going to be really interesting to learn more about, because I know there's like the outdoor coordinator kind of help that we need. Yeah. And I was more talking about the community partners that we have that currently do some of that outdoor work.
Yeah, but that's not
right.
what that piece was completely sort of built around the idea of providing a safe space for students to be on the days that they are not in school. So that is really and I think that, you know, this is where, if we move forward with, you know, with in-person learning within a month, you know, most of the costs associated with that will be to provide before and after care to extend, so significantly reducing the costs associated with that versus, you know, providing half of our kids, you know, a full day's worth of activities in a Boys and Girls Club or Y or in any other, you know, organization. So I think that, you know, if we move forward with in-person learning, that dollar figure could change significantly, you know, from the way that it was originally calculated.
Other questions or comments?
Can I just just add something that just occurred to me, which I know you know, and so I'm going to repeat myself, but I think like we need to repeat this for ourselves over and over again, that only gets us through December, right? So that I just want to keep coming back to the fact that, you know, and so that's why when Mr. Atkinson asks the question, you know, without additional, you know, funding, what happens? And I don't know. I mean, you know, there are significant expenses, you know, like obviously the facilities expenses and the purchases of the equipment. Those are, you know, like legit and done by the end of December. So we're good there. But anything that involves staff, anything that includes the childcare, you know, that means that we don't have a resource base to be able to continue that past the semester break.
Emily?
I certainly hear that, but and the staffing costs seem like the biggest area, right? Because on childcare, if we have elementary school students in school 5 days a week, the families that choose to be in person, that, you know, clearly there's before and after school, but that helps, it minimizes it helps reduce that item quite a bit.
But there's other staffing costs, right? So the substitute, you know, the substitute teachers, the, you know, outdoor coordinators, the, you know, the folks to make sure that, you know, bathrooms are clean and, you know, we're checking you know, that everybody did their self-check and things along those lines. Those folks, you know, the extra specialist teachers, so that teachers can get their, you know, 45-minute planning period during the day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are only budgeted in CRF through the, you know, through the winter break.
Anyone else right now? So I don't have anything else myself. I think I just want to thank you guys for the presentation and all the thought and work that's gone into this. I think these are, you know, perfectly legitimate, reasonable areas to be looking at spending this money. I'm glad that we have this resource coming to us, and obviously we have some questions about how to maintain some of the stuff that we'll be able to put in going forward. So we'll have to continue to have discussions around that.
And I think I try to say this at every session, and I'm going to say it at this one too. Without this money, we would be in a completely different place. So I am, you know, incredibly grateful for, you know, a governor and, you know, state organization, you know, structure that has said, like, okay, we've got to really support schools in doing this. I can't imagine what it would be like to try to do this stuff without those resources.
Just to second that, to hear what some districts around the country are grappling with in terms of both the higher, you know, much higher COVID rates and the lack of the infrastructure and support they need to even start to be able to make their facility safe and take all the precautions needed. I just underscores what a different situation we are in here, in great part due to our leadership.
Yeah.
Miranda, thank you so much. I'm gonna keep with your staying flexible as the situation changes throughout the year. I'm gonna try to keep that in mind. So I appreciate your using that to help frame the discussion tonight.
Can you remind me to do that too? When you see my panic and when you see my eyes go like that. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye.